So once again, I would like to thank everybody for joining us for our first Habitat of Colorado Lunch and Learn. I don't know about you, but I have some leftover chili for my lunch today. I think I will wait until after the webinar, but just thought I would add that in there. My name is Karen Kallenberg, and I am the Director of Training and Development with Habitat of Colorado. We are excited to kick off our first of a three-part board governance series. As I mentioned, we are recording the webinar. We will send you a link to the webinar, as well as our facilitator today, Emily, has provided us with some great handouts for after the presentation, so we will make sure to get that out to you as well. In addition, we'll be sending a link to this webinar recording to our affiliate EDs, and we just would really encourage you to help us spread the word and get more of your fellow board members listening in on the recording. But I will say you have the opportunity later to ask questions, and I think participating over the lunch hour in person is the best way to do it. So we really appreciate that as well. We will have, we had 8 affiliates register from Colorado and New Mexico, and then we have a couple of our board members from Habitat of Colorado. So thank you again. And I want to introduce, and I'm going to turn things over to our facilitator today, Emily Davis. Hopefully you have read her bio, so I'm not going to read her bio in full, but I thought I would just point out again that we have been lucky to have Emily with us at the past 2 Camp Colorado conferences. She is always one of the most highly rated facilitators that we have, and in saying that, we always actually have facilitators get great reviews. So she is at the top of some already great presenters. So I really appreciate her commitment and wanting to be a part of this initial board webinar series. And I think we are all very fortunate to hear from her expertise today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Emily.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Thanks for the kind words, and thank you for always inviting me to participate and talk about the thing that I nerd out most about, which is board governance. But before we do that, I think some of the logistics we've been covering for the webinar, but as Karen noted, everybody's muted, and this helps with the quality of the recording to cut down on background noise. But we very much want you to be participating actively in this webinar, and we have some poll questions and things that we'll need your feedback on. Additionally, you will see a chat box on your screen, and in that chat box, you're welcome to leave questions or comments for the entire group. You can send messages to other individuals. What we will do is pause periodically, just a couple times in the middle and at the end, to really go over any questions that you might have, but I keep my eye on that chat box. So as we go, if you have questions, I might be able to answer them in real time rather than even waiting. We are obviously recording this. Karen mentioned that already, and we have follow-up materials as well. So there's all kinds of good stuff coming at you, basically. With that, what would be really helpful for me is, webinars are a really great way to share information virtually across boundaries, geographic boundaries, but I also would like to know a little bit about who's on the phone so I can help really craft as much of this conversation to what your needs are. And so with that, I was hoping to ask a little bit about the folks on the phone, and then I'll share a little bit more about myself. And the way I'd like to learn this is actually we're going to start with this question well, our questions got confused. Hold on one second. Oh, there we go. There's the right one. The first question is, where are you located? So if you can just share your geographic location, that would be awesome. Just type it in there and hit submit. Okay, Durango. Awesome. Denver, okay. This is great. There's quite the widespread geographically. Buena Vista, awesome. Fantastic. Okay, wonderful. So the other thing that would be helpful for me to know is if you can click on the screen in front of you, describe your role. If you are a staff member, if you're a board member, or other, this might be a guest or something like that. It's nice to know who is on the phone. Certainly, having executive directors in particular participate in the board governance conversation is really important because they themselves are part of the governing body. The difference being that they are non-voting and paid, hopefully, whereas board members are voting but unpaid, so volunteer. So great. And so you want to, for the folks who are chatting, you're going to want to actually use the poll on the screen rather than the chat box for a couple of these things. Great. So it looks like we have a couple staff members, 6 board members, and it looks like other, so a guest. And then I've got one more question for you at this moment is there a question or concern you have about board governance for today's webinar? So in other words, what brought you here? I say a lot, and some of you may have heard me say this before, is that in the nonprofit sector, we do an outstanding job of asking people to serve on nonprofit boards. However, we don't do a great job of explaining what that means. So, and there's a lot of, if you want to get academic about it, there's a lot of different models out there. There's the Carver model. There's all different kinds of things. I use the board source model, which here's the deal. In my experience, it's the best of both the theory and the practice. I am a senior governance consultant with BoardSource, which again just means I'm a gigantic governance nerd. And really why that's important to me, or why I've focused on it so much, is because the success of nonprofits really comes down to leadership. And the ultimate leadership of the organization is in the governance bucket. So executive directors and the board of directors as a collective. So a couple folks have shared, it's the first time serving as a board member, want to learn more. And then one of the questions is about how do you transition from a heavily operational active board to a lower level of board activity. So this is a great question that really has to do with a couple things: organizational life cycle stages, but also board members understanding what hat they need to be wearing when, so they aren't micromanaging, but looking at real governance topics, which is fantastic. So great. As folks have additional questions or concerns, please be sure to share them in that chat box. We have a total of 60 minutes together, so I am going to move us forward to the next piece. Oh, meetings are too long. Yeah. Using board meetings is a time for really concentrated governance discussions are really hard. I actually just worked with an organization that their board meetings are 8 hours long, which is just not a good use of time. Okay, so there's a lot of good questions. Hopefully we can get to as much of this today as possible. Very good, sophisticated questions, and we'll start with the foundations and take it from there. The other thing I wanted to share was just a bit more about me, not to go into a great deal of detail, but all of this information about me is just to say that I've worn a lot of different hats. I've been an executive director, staff member, volunteer, founder, grant maker, board member, and so I have looked at the world of nonprofit governance through a lot of different lenses. And my job is really to translate that information the best way I know how, and with the resources available to help really sort of decode this work. One of the questions I have to start off is, we are asked to join boards, and we join boards for a variety of reasons. one of the biggest reasons we join boards are, A, we have a connection to the organization, personal or otherwise, and somebody asked us. We want to give back, but as board members, there's a lot of ways we could give back, and it's usually the things that we have a close connection to and really want to experience serving. Now, one of the questions I have for you all to share here is what might be scary about joining a board? What are the fears or hesitations you had or currently have for joining a Habitat board or any other board for that matter? This is, again, when we join boards of directors, sometimes there isn't a lot of clarity. And so what fears or hesitations did you have? What questions did you have before joining your board? Yeah, so the first comment is about the amount of time needed. 100%. I think that's probably the most concerning topic for folks when they join boards is how much time do I really need to put into this thing, and do I have the time? The overwhelming rules, regulations, so on and so forth. Right. So one of the concerns is board members are both legally and fiscally responsible for the organization. So there can be real concern about, what if I do the wrong thing at the wrong time, and am I going to put the organization at risk? What about real or perceived conflicts of interest? Yeah, legal liability. So let me say this about legal liability. Every 501c3 organization, nonprofit 501c3 organization, should absolutely have directors and officers insurance. And you can talk to Mountain Employer States Council. They have good resources on that. But it's really important for your board to have their own insurance as volunteers, basically. All right. So one of the reasons I always ask boards, why would you leave a board? So once you've gotten on the board, why would you leave a board? And one thing is, people have life changes, their schedule shifts, they might have kids, they might have a new job, they might move someplace else. The other is term limits. So every board in their bylaws has board terms. So it might be a 2-year term or a 3-year term with an option to renew however many times. Typically, the total number of years somebody can serve on a board is 6. So that might be 3 terms of 2 years or 2 terms of 3 years, and they have to rotate off for a year and have an opportunity to come back on. The trouble is when you have board terms without term limits. And those term limits are what I just described as the amount of terms that one can't fulfill. So, 2 3-year term limits or 3 2-year term limits. Part of that is that without term limits is you really restrict the diversity and perspectives that you could get on the board. For a lot of organizations, this looks like the same people around the table doing business as usual, and it's an important conversation to have with your board. Then the final question is, why would you stay, right? Why would you stay on a board? And it's usually because we love the organization. We love what they do, but even more than that, it's about the people that are on the board, the people who run the organization. And you always want to remember those stories that connect you back to the mission. Okay, so speaking of some of those questions, concerns, hesitations that you all had, let's talk about some of the essential board responsibilities. And listen, these are the 10 basic board responsibilities that are true for any nonprofit board, They span all of them. And I'm just going to review these real quickly. Determining mission and purpose is pretty straightforward for most organizations, right? This is what we do. This is why we're here. Selecting the chief executive refers to the executive director or CEO. I use those interchangeably because people have used different language, but it all means the same thing. Select the chief executive. For a lot of organizations, that don't have paid staff. This will come later, but it is a part of their role. Support and evaluate this executive. So you'll notice this doesn't say throw them under the bus. Support and evaluate is, conducting performance reviews on an annual basis and highlighting the strengths and the challenges and working with the CEO to really define what's going to set him or her up for success. Ensure effective planning. These are things like fundraising plans, marketing plans, strategic plans, which in particular we're going to talk about more next. Monitoring and strengthening programs and services. So this actually speaks a bit to one of the questions or comments earlier already, is that this does not say micromanage or run programs and services. This is really about providing oversight and asking questions about the impact and effectiveness of programs and services so that you all as board members can determine, A, what's financially viable, what makes the most sense, what creates the most benefit in the community. The next is ensuring adequate financial resources. This is fundraising. This is what this is. And we actually have other conversations coming up about fundraising and board responsibilities. The next one is also financially related, protect assets and provide financial oversight. So this is being able to read financial documents, right? So balance sheets, P&L reports. And if you're somebody like me, those don't tell me much of a story. I get pretty confused, and I really every year have to and commit to sending myself to sort of a refresher course on reading nonprofit financial statements, which are different than corporate or for-profit financial statements in some ways. So what I want to train myself to do always is to be able to read through the numbers to read a story, and that gives me good questions to ask. The next is build a competent board. You'll notice this does not just say build a board, it's build a competent board. Building a competent board means finding, recruiting, and engaging board members who are open to excellence in board service. This doesn't mean they've sat on 15 boards and they know exactly what they're doing. It means finding the right fit for your organization. Some people grow into their roles better than others, so figuring out that mix. Ensuring legal and ethical integrity. I think this is pretty obvious in terms, and usually a good win for nonprofits is following the law and the spirit of the law. And then finally, enhancing the organization's good public standing. This is, the organization's doing so well that I have no problem bragging about it or serving as an ambassador. Another way we could break down those basic board responsibilities are into these three buckets. So the first is setting organizational direction. Second is providing oversight. And third is ensuring necessary resources. And that really refers to both human and financial resources. What does that mean? Well, if we look at setting organizational direction as our first bucket, this is really about strategic planning. One of the things I'd like to know from this group is, does your organization, do you all have a written 3 to 5 year strategic plan currently? So 3 have said yes. Great. Look at this. Good numbers. Great. So the vast majority of folks who are responding do have a written 3 to 5 year strategic plan. That is awesome. That is wonderful. Congratulations on accomplishing that goal, because it's not an easy one. I'm going to give you my 2 cents world according to Emily's strategic planning, because I think that strategic planning is widely misunderstood. One of the things that a lot of folks think about in strategic planning is that you write a document and that's it. Well, a lot of times those documents just get pushed into a file folder or a drawer and they're never used. One of the reasons for that is the approach you take to strategic planning is just as important as the resulting documentation itself. So We always talk about how strategic planning is a process and not a document. We don't do strategic plans that are any more than 3 years long because things just change too fast. We also think that the best strategic plans are stakeholder informed. So stakeholders include board, staff, broader community members, donors, key volunteers. All different kinds of people help to really set the strategic direction of the organization. And that happens through surveys and input calls and document audits, all kinds of nerdy stuff. And that strategic plan really gets broken down into a narrative along with complementary resources and ways to actually use that plan. How do you make it implementable? And how we go about strategic planning is well, first of all, in corporations, it's much different than nonprofits. In corporate strategic planning, typically what happens is the board of directors says to the CEO, write the plan and implement it. It's different in nonprofits. In nonprofits, strategic planning is really shared. The process is shared by the board of directors as a collective and the executive director. And so it does look a little bit different. Now, our strategic planning processes are anywhere between 3 months and 9 months, depending on what kind of work needs to happen. But this is kind of the kitchen sink of strategic planning for us. And I share this with you as a comparison because it's important to know what the full possibilities are. I think, again, strategic planning isn't widely understood in terms of what works best. And we really break down our process into these 4 stages. The discovery phase, where we're collecting all that data, right? I mentioned stakeholder input, document, audit, and we use all that information to give a snapshot of where we think the organization is in its organizational life cycle stage. So in organizational life cycle stages, you have everything from idea to startup to growth to maturity to an opportunity for either decline or turnaround, and then organizations that just go out of business or defunct. And so it helps us to analyze that so we can make the best recommendations for where an organization needs to prioritize their time. From there is where we go to the retreat. So that discovery phase is usually about 3 months, 2 to 3 months. Then we get to the retreat where we can dig in and have some really good, rich conversations and talk about best practices in board governance, maybe do a SWOT, maybe do a message map. There's all different things. But I think there's a common misconception that we're going to do a strategic planning retreat and then walk out of the retreat with it. Can't do it. You can, but it doesn't work very well. So we have this go slow to go fast approach, meaning we collect all this information, do the retreat, then we can start to write and talk about how to implement the plan. And again, as part of setting organizational direction, most board members are not experts in nonprofit strategic planning. So what are the options out there? What are the different questions that you all can ask as you go through the process of looking at the vision for the next 3 years for your organization and how to prioritize those activities? So I want to just pause here for a second and see if there are any questions about strategic planning first, because we're going to move on to talking about providing oversight to the organization, but be sure to go ahead and leave any questions you have about strategic planning there in the chat box. And we're going to pause for questions here again in a second, but I'm going to keep going forward as people chat any questions you might have, and I can come back to it. So the other bucket I mentioned was providing oversight. For providing oversight, this feels a little bit vague. What does that mean? I really like this metaphor of the tabletop that Susan Kenny-Stevens, who's really the matriarch of organizational life cycles, she talks about that any organization mission is really reliant on the programs that serve that mission, right? The action we take to best serve that mission? Well, the programs uphold the mission. What upholds the programs? And it's really 4 legs. So one of those legs is governance, right? It's board members. The other leg is management. That's the executive director or the staff. The next leg is financial resources. That's the money. So, I often talk about nonprofits. They don't run on rainbows and fairy dust. We actually have to have financial resources to make sure that our organizations are viable businesses. Nonprofits are businesses, absolutely. They're a different kind of business, but they are businesses, and it's important for board members to know the financial resources that go into achieving the programs and the mission. Then the 4th leg are these administrative systems. These are things like databases, policies and procedures. You do need some element of that in order to keep the boat moving forward, right? Everybody rowing kind of in the same direction. Now, if you lose any one of those legs, what happens? The flowers fall down. Your mission falls and stumbles. And so I would argue that different legs are at different lengths at different times in an organization's life. But this gives us a nice idea as board members, that we need to ask questions. How are we doing our administrative systems? Do we have strong management? Do we need more money? What kind of board members do we need to really even out those legs and best serve the programs and the mission of the organization so that tabletop doesn't tip? Well, how do you get that information? Really, there's 2 things. One is asking the question. It's usually knowing what questions to ask and asking those questions. But the other is to gather data. One of the things that board members should do is conduct a board self-assessment. For us, when we do strategic planning, we conduct a board assessment or an organizational assessment as part of that strategic planning process. Another really good place to conduct a board self-assessment is in the beginning of a board recruitment process. The other thing that's really important is conducting an assessment of your executive director. Now, I really love this conversation because, for many executive directors, the question is, how do I know what I'm doing well, or how do I know where I want the board to focus me if they don't have information in a performance review, they can't really know. I was facilitating a retreat a number of years back, and the executive director, who was part-time, had been there 7 years, had never had a performance review, and really was craving that feedback, and had asked very specifically the board for this. So in the strategic planning retreat, we talked about the importance of executive director evaluation. And one of the board members said to me, I totally disagree with you. I don't think you're right about the importance of performance review. And I said, well, that's okay, so let's have a conversation about that. What does performance evaluation look like to you? And his response was, if I've got a problem with them, I'll let them know, which I thought was very tongue-in-cheek and cute, but that's not actually evaluation. Evaluation includes more of a 360 approach to getting feedback from stakeholders, board members, staff members, and really compiling strong recommendations for your executive director. You can also see assessments of everything from your committees. How is it annually how are committees going? Are people enjoying their roles in committees? Meetings, obviously getting the most obvious feedback we think of is program evaluation, what's working for our volunteers, so on and so forth. But there's so much further you can go in terms of gathering data so that you set the organization up for success. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions, because we've covered the first two buckets And there's a lot more we can talk about. I would love to hear what questions or experiences other folks have with strategic planning, with assessment, so in other words, setting organizational direction and providing oversight. Do you feel like your board does this well? What works for you? So go ahead and share your comments in the chat box. And Karen, I don't know if you have any questions or
I do. I have a question here that I can read off to the group. Going back to the strategic plan, kind of a several-part question actually, Emily. How often should you review it? What is the board's role in reviewing it? And then kind of going with it, making it a living document versus checking it off the list just to say, when somebody asked us, like you did, do we have one? It's more than just answering yes, we're actually utilizing the document.
Crazy that someone would want to actually use the document that they've created. Yeah, so great question. My opinion is that strategic planning, once you have your strategic plan in place, then you should have an update annually to it. That you really, in a retreat, for example, that you prepare and discuss the strategic plan. Now, that goes hand in hand with your second question about how do I actually implement and use the plan. In order for a plan to be effective, it shouldn't be referred to just once a year. It should be integrated into the organization. When we write strategic plans and present them, we actually talk really specifically about all these different implementation strategies. And I brought this slide up again about the process because under implementation are a couple examples. So we create what's called a dashboard for implementation. Our narrative, the narrative of our strategic plans are usually somewhere around 40 pages, which is a lot. And that's not easy to reference, right? But it's got a lot of ideas and information. So we literally create kind of a spreadsheet for an organization that highlights like who's responsible, what's the timeline. It's a quick reference guide, right, to the strategic plan. And quarterly, at least quarterly at board meetings, you should really be referring to that and say, where are we at? You're kind of taking the temperature. The other thing is to designate a board champion, is what we call them, an individual from the board who's really going to make sure to keep the eye on the prize. Like any of the goals and objectives related to, say, board governance, who's going to be that person to say, I'm going to check in quarterly and see how we're doing and just keep my finger on the pulse of it all. I think also having, if you want to create reports or things like that to keep the board updated, that's always a great idea as well. So those are a couple recommendations that I have as it's related to strategic planning.
Great, thank you. I was going to say we have another question.
Yes, I see that.
Okay. Should the board have to approve all financial expenditures above a certain level and all hires and changes in benefit plans? The big question.
That's a great question. Okay, so I'm going to give you the typical consultant answer. It depends, which is not everybody's favorite answer, and I totally understand. Typically, boards do have, what they'll have in their bylaws is that there needs to be approval from, the entire board or the executive committee or the treasurer on financial expenditures above a certain level. That varies based on sort of the organizational size. One of the things you want to make sure of is that you're not restricting the executive director to the point that he or she can't make financial decisions. In fact, that's what you've charged that person with as a board. But you also want to have internal controls and checks and balances in place so the board is providing that oversight. So the first thing is, I don't think that's unreasonable. The devil's in the details. If you are requiring board approval on a $250 expenditure, then you're micromanaging. If it's 5,000 or 10,000, that makes more sense. The only hire that the board should really hire, staff hiring that the board should be involved with, is the executive director. You hire the executive director to really be the one to know what's best for the organization and hire other staff. I can tell you that I have been in a position as a board member where I did not agree with the hire of the executive director, the hire that she made. That's not my call. That's her call. She's boots on the ground every day doing that work. Now, if I had been on, say, the hiring committee and working side by side with the executive director or other people, there's a hiring committee for that job, I could have given my opinion, but ultimately that one's up to the executive director. Now, you can certainly ask questions about, what's the feedback we're getting on programming related to this person's work, but the executive director's job is the staff. And then finally, changes in benefit plans. I would say yes, that oftentimes is a board discussion because it usually has to do with financial oversight and management. Typically what happens is the executive director will present options for benefit plans, and the board will ask questions about it and approve or give guidance to the executive director to move forward on those questions or concerns. So I hope that was a pretty good answer, because that's a very multifaceted question, and I liked it. So thank you, Gary. And then, Karen, are we good to move on with this next part and open up for questions after?
Yes, I think we are good. Thank you, Emily.
Okay, of course. All right, good question. Thank you. The last bucket, and certainly probably the biggest one to talk about, is ensuring necessary resources. This is a big one, and I know we have a future webinar to dig into the fundraising aspect of this more deeply. What do we mean when we say ensuring necessary resources? Because it's pretty vague, but it's vague for a reason, so we can dive deeper into it. The first way we ensure necessary resources really has to do with people. Okay, so people includes things like the executive director, the CEO, that I was just responding to Gary about, is that it's the board's responsibility to identify, evaluate, support the executive director. The other responsibility of the board as a group is to recruit other board members. Oftentimes we see in nonprofits the executive director is really the only one recruiting people to the board. The board is ultimately responsible for itself. Now, it's not to say that the executive director isn't involved. He or she should absolutely be involved as part of the governing body of the organization. But board members need to have a process to recruit other board members. Be responsible for yourselves again. And then lastly, board members need to really be responsible for recruiting supporters, whether that's volunteers or donors, whatever it might be. We're going to talk about ambassadorship a little bit here in the next slide, but you are a critical liaison between the organization and the community, and so your role that you play within that in the supporters is essential. The next place where board members are responsible for ensuring those necessary resources are around policies. I'm working with an organization right now. I'm helping them revise their bylaws, which is a legal document, and you should review and update your bylaws probably every other year. There may not be anything to revise, but you want to do a quick check-in, tune up your bylaws where needed. And anyway, the organization I'm currently working with, they use their bylaws really as the place to put the kitchen sink of operations and procedures. You don't need to do that with your bylaws. Your bylaws are a legal document. You can use complementary or supplementary policies and procedures like job descriptions, committee descriptions, whatever it might be, to really outline what's appropriate and inappropriate for your organization. The most common policies that boards have and are required to have are a conflict of interest policy. But there are a plethora of other policies that are important to consider. Ethics and confidentiality, gift acceptance policy. So is there a corporation or a donor that, ethically it wouldn't be in good alignment for you to accept money from? The other along the money lines is board giving. And we're going to talk about this as well in one of our next webinars. But board giving is a really, really important topic, so I don't think you can talk about it enough. Every board member, every nonprofit board member should be making a personally significant financial contribution to the organization. That does not include time and money. When we talk about board governance, there's usually, we used to call them the 3 T's, time, talent, and treasure. So you're looking for board members who had time, talent, and treasure. Now there's really a 4th T we've added on, which is ties. So those networks, right? Network of supporters. And so the reason, and let me say there are different ways you can structure a board giving policy. Some organizations will say, the minimum amount of money a board member can give is $1,000, $10,000, $100,000, whatever it is. Great, because it sets an expectation. The downside of it is that you may limit who can serve on your board, and somebody who may have a lot to give to the board and skills and expertise and time may not be able to give that amount of money. So what we always say is that you want your board members, again, to make a personally significant financial gift. This means the organization, the Habitat organization that you're a part of, should be one of the top 3 places you give a financial gift. I don't care if that's $25. I don't care if it's $25,000. It should be something that's meaningful to that individual. You make different decisions as a board member when you have skin in the game. You set an example for other donors in the organization. Additionally, if I'm a donor and I'm coming in and being asked to give money, and your biggest champions, your biggest leaders in the organization aren't willing to do the same, you have a bit of a disconnect. It's hard for others to invest if the key leadership won't do so. Some organizations also have a combination of what individuals give financially as individuals and what they fundraise for on behalf of the organization. It's really up to your organization what's best. However, whatever model you go with, first thing is you need to document what that expectation is. You need to use it in recruitment and communicating with current and prospective board members. You need to hold each other accountable. This is not the executive director's responsibility. It's that of the board. And how do you do that? That's the other question, because you don't want to sit down at a board meeting and say, well, Jane, you haven't given your X amount of dollars. But what you can do is at every board meeting, report out the percentage of board members who've been able to give, and to say, our goal is to get to 100% board member giving by X date. Having 100% board members giving a financial contribution is absolutely critical for yet another reason, which is that a lot of foundations now will not give grants to organizations where board members do not have 100% financial contribution. The last thing that I'm going to say about this is I think a great way to give and to leverage your donor dollars as a board member is to use Colorado Gives Day. So, for example, what I've done in the past is I've given 50% of my financial contribution by June 30th, and then the other half I use as a matching opportunity on Colorado Gives Day. So we come up with a campaign to match my dollars, dollar for dollar. All right, so that's enough about board giving, but it's really important, so don't want to pass it by. Also, the other thing is just having those plans in place, having what's the fundraising strategies that you all will use and will not use. And the same thing for planning your recruitment and engagement of board members. The last piece around ensuring necessary resources is something that we're going to definitely dive into a lot more on a future webinar, but it's fundraising. The board, it's sort of the F word, right, of nonprofits. We don't like it. We tend to shy away from it. And fundraising, what's important to remember here, it's really a three-phase process. We tend to think of fundraising as just asking for money or begging for money, when in fact it's really about prospecting, cultivation, and stewardship, and ultimately building relationships with individuals. And so as board members, learning how to do that well is what's going to make fundraising both enjoyable and successful for your organization. Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about in terms of our roles and responsibilities, but probably one of the most important and most helpful, are the different hats we wear as board members. There's a lot of perspective in terms of, what can help us as board members really understand, what voice or what perspective we're coming to a conversation with. So for what I mean is, as board members, you're always a board member. That doesn't change, right? But we wear different hats at different times. So for example, these are the three hats: legal, volunteer, and ambassador. That legal hat is the hat we wear, I think of it most commonly in board meetings. So duty of care is, coming to board meetings prepared, asking pertinent questions, staying true to the mission, right? Duty of loyalty are things like avoiding conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest. So you're staying loyal to that mission again. And then the next is duty of obedience. And it's really about being a good steward of the law, whether it is federal, state, regional, or your own bylaws. Is again, really adhering to the law and staying true to the spirit of the law. So I think about that hat a lot when I'm in board meetings or preparing for board meetings. The second hat is this volunteer hat. And the volunteer hat is really different because as a volunteer, you are working for the staff. Wearing your legal hat, the staff is working for you through the executive director. But if you're in a volunteer role, you really want to avoid micromanaging. So an example I often give is, let's say you're at a fundraising event and you don't like, you don't like the color of the napkin. The staff has chosen a color of the napkins that you don't like. At that point, you are working for the staff. They have decided that for a reason. You may not know all the background, but that is their job. Let them do their job. And so wearing that volunteer hat, you want to be really careful not to micromanage. The third hat is the ambassador hat. And this hat is all about, this is the fundraising hat really, is what I like to think about. And it's honestly my favorite hat because it's where you get to brag about the organization. You have to know about what's happening in the organization to be a good ambassador, but you're making connections, you're sharing resources with the organization. Really, you're a cheerleader for the organization. And now, not everybody goes about being an ambassador in the same way. That's okay. There's a lot of different ways to be an ambassador, and something that takes a lot of time to learn about in that role and to figure out what fits best for you as an individual. So with that, I want to see what questions you all have in particular about ensuring necessary resources, because, and again, this is something we're going to dive more deeply into in an upcoming webinar in October, but I think it's really a really important role for board members. So I'd love to hear if you have questions about the different hats we wear, the pieces around policies, fundraising, engaging supporters. So feel free to type in your questions there in that chat box. And we will watch for them. And Karen, do you have anything that you want to?
I see a question here, Emily.
Oh, I don't see it. Sorry.
So a question would be, what happens as a board member if you're serving, you're wearing your volunteer hat. So in our case, you're on the construction site, you're serving as a Restore volunteer, and you see something that you think is wrong or inappropriate. How do you then handle that?
Yeah, that's a great one. And certainly, I will say I have been in that position myself, and it's a little uncomfortable. The first thing to do is to talk to your executive director. If you have a concern about how things are operating, you need to reach out to the CEO to really communicate with him or her your concern and let that person handle it. Our executive directors are the ones with literally boots on the ground every day. They know a lot more about the internal workings of staff, of volunteers, of board members, the personalities that we cannot possibly know. And let me just say this about executive directors. Having been one multiple times, it is absolutely one of the hardest jobs out there. No one's ever going to know everything that person knows. They understand all the moving pieces, especially if you've hired a great executive director, which is the board's job. But if you have feedback, if you're wearing that volunteer hat and you're really displeased with something that's going on, you have a question, you have a concern, the first place you go is your executive director. And, here's the thing is that if your executive director is unresponsive or you're not pleased with that, then you have another conversation. You can talk with another trusted board member to come up with a plan. But what is not appropriate is to go to a staff member, another volunteer, and say, no, this is how you're going to do it. That's the executive director's job. And you displace the leadership of the executive director by taking an approach like that. Now, if the executive director isn't performing or isn't fulfilling his or her roles and responsibilities as been laid out by the board, you can talk about that through a performance evaluation. But nitpicking individual instances of problems directly to staff or volunteers as a board member is tricky. You have to be careful with that. The other thing I would say, Karen, is that with the boards that I've served on with the executive directors, sometimes it's not knowing what hat you're wearing, it's knowing what to even ask, right? So what I mean by that is I would oftentimes go to my executive director and say, am I wearing the right hat right now? Am I getting too down in the weeds? Do I need to sort of pull up in altitude? I'm not really sure where I need to be. And you can ask other board members, like, am I wearing the right hat right now? And that's what I really like about the hat metaphor, is it helps me ask, am I wearing the right hat, and what hat should I be wearing? And hopefully those two things are the same.
Great, thank you.
Sure. I'm not seeing too many other questions come in, which either means I've been brilliant or you all know this stuff, which also, either one are great. They're fantastic. A lot of times these conversations open up more questions, and folks often say, wow, I wish, our executive director had been here, another board member had been here. And one of the things that Karen and I talked about is we want you to have these resources, the slides and the other resources that she'll send afterwards, and the recording to really continue to open up the conversation and learn best practices. And I also mentioned in a couple different places that we have upcoming webinars, and I didn't know, Karen, if you wanted to share a bit more about those.
Yes, we are excited to bring you 2 more topics, and I should have said in the very beginning as well, we did poll some of the affiliates to try to get an idea about what would be good topics, and that is where our first 3 governance webinars came from. And so as Emily said, we'll be talking about board ambassadors, ensuring necessary resources, and then that'll be in October. When this webinar closes, you'll have the opportunity to register for that. We hope you'll join us again and encourage others from your affiliate. And we also have one on shared leadership between board and staff coming up in November as well.
Yeah, these are both topics that I get really excited about. I think that the ambassadorship, that's really about fundraising and how can board members engage in that way, and understanding that the other being the shared leadership is that how the two governing bodies, the board is the collective and the executive director, how do you really operate most efficiently, understanding the various roles that we have. So really excited about that. This is my information in case that's helpful for folks. But we certainly have a bit more time, a couple minutes left here if folks have questions or comments or stories that they might want to share, any resources that you want to share with your fellow webinar participants. This is a great place to do that.
And you can just type those in the chat box.
Mm-hmm. And then Karen, thank you. I'm glad you were, what a lovely comment. Yes, you're welcome. Thanks for being on the webinar. And Karen, you're sending out the link to the webinar that's been recorded, or how can people expect to collect that information?
Yes, I will send it out to all of the participants today, so you will get it directly, and then I will also send it to all of our affiliate executive directors, so they have access to forward it on as well.
Cool. That's great. Well, it looks like we don't have too many questions coming in, which is wonderful. Anything else you have, Karen? Otherwise, I leave it to you.
No, I think that's all. We appreciate, again, everybody's time today over lunch. We appreciate Emily. I wrote down a couple of good quotes, too. I love the "we don't run on rainbows and fairy dust," so thank you. I think I'll use that at our next board meeting. So, but yes, thank you. Thank you very much. We appreciate Emily, and we appreciate all of you spending the hour with us today.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.